The earthquake struck at 4:47 in the morning on a Tuesday in late October, ripping through the coastal hills of Santa Barbara County with a violence that seemed almost personal, as if the earth itself had decided to shake loose every secret it had been holding for decades. Daniel Reeves woke to the sound of his German shepherd, Atlas, barking with an urgency that cut through the rumbling and the crashing and the primal terror of a world coming apart at the seams. And his first coherent thought was that he had been here before, that he had felt this same helpless fear in places far from California, in cities whose names still haunted his dreams. But this was different. This was home. This was the small ranch house he had bought 3 years ago with the settlement money from the VA, the quiet property in the hills above Goleta where he had come to escape the noise of a world that had never felt quite right since he came back from his 3rd deployment with a Purple Heart and a mind full of ghosts. The shaking lasted 47 seconds, though it felt like an eternity. Daniel had served 2 tours in Iraq and 1 in Afghanistan, had been under fire more times than he could count, had watched friends die in explosions that came without warning, and yet something about an earthquake was different from combat. In a firefight, at least you could shoot back. You could take cover, return fire, do something to affect the outcome. An earthquake offered no such illusion of control. You were simply at the mercy of forces so vast and indifferent that human agency became meaningless, a leaf in a hurricane, a speck of dust in an avalanche. All you could do was hold on and pray and wait for it to end. When the shaking finally stopped, Daniel found himself on the floor beside his bed, Atlas pressed against him, the dog's powerful body trembling, but his eyes fixed on Daniel's face with an expression of fierce devotion. The house was still standing, which seemed like a miracle given the intensity of what they had just experienced. Power was out, of course, and Daniel could hear things settling and shifting in the darkness, the groans and creaks of a structure that had been pushed to its limits. But he was alive. Atlas was alive. For the moment, that was enough. The first light of dawn revealed the extent of the damage. The ranch house had survived, as Daniel had suspected, its old-fashioned construction and solid foundation having weathered the assault better than many newer buildings would have. But the property around it was transformed. The old oak tree that had stood in the front yard for what must have been 100 years had toppled, its massive root system torn from the earth and leaving a crater that looked like a wound in the land. The barn had partially collapsed, though thankfully Daniel hadn't kept any animals in it. The driveway was cracked and buckled in several places, and a section of the hillside behind the house had slumped downward, creating a raw scar of exposed earth that stretched for perhaps 50 yards. It was Atlas who first noticed something unusual about the landslide. While Daniel was walking the property, assessing damage and making mental notes about what would need to be repaired, the German shepherd had wandered toward the exposed hillside and begun to dig with an intensity that Daniel had rarely seen in their 3 years together. Atlas was a trained search and rescue dog, one of the best in Santa Barbara County, and Daniel had learned long ago to trust his instincts. If Atlas was digging, there was usually a reason. Daniel approached cautiously, mindful that the ground might still be unstable after the quake. Atlas had excavated perhaps 2 feet into the loose soil and was now pawing at something metallic, his whines taking on an excited quality that Daniel recognized from their training exercises. When Daniel got close enough to see what the dog had found, his breath caught in his throat. Emerging from the earth like something out of an archaeological dig was the corner of what appeared to be a steel hatch, the kind you might see on a submarine or a fallout shelter, rusted and dirt-encrusted but unmistakably man-made. Daniel stood there for a long moment, staring at the hatch, his mind racing through possibilities. He had bought this property from the estate of an elderly woman named Margaret Chen, who had passed away at 93, and he had been told almost nothing about its history. The real estate agent had mentioned that the original house dated back to the 1950s, built during the height of Cold War paranoia, but there had been no mention of any underground structures. If this was a fallout shelter, it had been forgotten or deliberately concealed, buried under decades of accumulated soil and vegetation until the earthquake had exposed it to daylight. The responsible thing to do would be to call someone, Daniel knew. The county building department, or maybe a structural engineer, someone who could assess whether the shelter was safe to enter and whether it posed any danger to the surrounding area. But something held him back. Maybe it was the look in Atlas's eyes, the certainty that there was something important down there. Maybe it was the curiosity that had always been both his greatest strength and his greatest weakness. Or maybe it was simply the fact that after everything he had been through, after all the years of following orders and playing by the rules and trusting institutions that had let him down more times than he could count, Daniel wanted to discover something for himself. He spent the rest of that first day clearing debris and digging out the hatch, working slowly and carefully to avoid triggering another slide. Atlas stayed by his side the entire time, occasionally helping to dig, or simply watching with that patient intensity that characterized everything he did. By late afternoon, the hatch was fully exposed, a circular steel door, perhaps 3 feet in diameter, set into a concrete collar that had been poured directly into the hillside. There was a wheel in the center, like the kind used to seal watertight doors on ships, and despite its age and exposure to the elements, it turned with surprising ease when Daniel applied his weight to it. The hatch opened with a groan of protesting metal, releasing a breath of stale air that smelled of dust and old paper, and something else, something that Daniel couldn't quite identify, but that felt somehow familiar. Below the hatch was a ladder, steel rungs set into a concrete shaft that descended into darkness. Daniel retrieved a flashlight from his emergency kit and shone it down into the hole, revealing a depth of perhaps 15 feet before the shaft opened into what appeared to be a larger space. His heart was pounding now, not with fear, but with a kind of anticipation that he hadn't felt in years. Whatever was down there, it had been waiting a long time to be found. Atlas went first, as he always did when they were working a search. The dog descended the ladder with a grace that belied his size, his paws finding each rung with practiced precision, and Daniel followed close behind, the flashlight gripped between his teeth. When he reached the bottom and stepped off the ladder onto solid concrete, he found himself in a space that exceeded his expectations. This wasn't just a simple fallout shelter. This was something else entirely. The room was perhaps 20 feet square, with a ceiling high enough that Daniel could stand upright with room to spare. The walls were lined with shelves, most of them empty now, but clearly designed to hold supplies. In one corner stood a small cot, its mattress long since rotted away to nothing. In another corner was a desk, surprisingly intact, with a chair that had somehow survived the decades underground. There were filing cabinets along one wall, their drawers hanging open and empty, and a small chemical toilet that Daniel gave a wide berth. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, undisturbed until Atlas's entrance had stirred it into swirling clouds that danced in the beam of the flashlight. But it was the desk that drew Daniel's attention, or more precisely, what sat on top of it. Amid the dust and the decay, there was a wooden box, perhaps the size of a shoebox, that looked remarkably well preserved. It was made of cedar, Daniel realized as he got closer, the aromatic wood having protected whatever was inside from the moisture and insects that had destroyed so much else in this forgotten space. The box was closed, but not locked. Its simple brass clasp, green with age, but still functional. Daniel hesitated for just a moment, feeling the weight of years pressing down on him, before he reached out and lifted the lid. Inside the box, wrapped in cloth that had once been white but had yellowed with time, was a collection of papers. Letters, Daniel saw as he carefully lifted them out, handwritten letters in an elegant script that spoke of an era before computers and texting and email, when people still took the time to put pen to paper and craft their thoughts into permanent form. There were perhaps 24 of them, each one dated and signed, spanning a period from 1962 to 1967. And beneath the letters, at the very bottom of the box, was a photograph, a black and white image of a young woman in a nurse's uniform, her dark hair pinned back from a face that radiated intelligence and warmth, her eyes looking directly into the camera with an expression that seemed to pierce through the decades and speak directly to Daniel's heart. He didn't read the letters that first night. The aftershocks were still coming, small tremors that reminded him the earth was not yet finished with its upheaval, and Daniel was exhausted from the day's exertions and the emotional toll of the earthquake. He climbed back out of the shelter with the cedar box tucked under his arm, sealed the hatch behind him, and returned to his damaged house with Atlas at his side. He ate a cold dinner by candlelight, fed Atlas, and fell into a fitful sleep on the couch, the box of letters sitting on the coffee table like a question waiting to be answered. The next morning brought clearer skies and a semblance of normalcy, if anything could be called normal in the wake of a 6.8 magnitude earthquake. The power was still out across much of the county, but Daniel's generator kicked in without complaint, and he was able to make coffee and toast and sit at his kitchen table like a civilized human being. Atlas lay at his feet, his eyes never leaving Daniel's face, as if he knew that something important was about to happen. And then, with the morning sun streaming through the windows and the weight of anticipation heavy in his chest, Daniel opened the cedar box and began to read. The first letter was dated March 15, 1962, and it began with a salutation that set the tone for everything that followed. My dearest James, I know I should not be writing to you. I know the risks for both of us if these letters are ever discovered, but I cannot help myself. What we have found together is too precious to deny, too beautiful to keep locked away in silence. So I will write, and I will trust you to keep these letters safe, and I will hope that someday, somehow, we will find a way to be together openly, without fear, without shame, without the weight of a world that would never understand. The letter was signed, Your Margaret, and as Daniel read those words, he felt a chill run down his spine. Margaret, the woman who had owned this property, who had lived in this house for more than 60 years, who had died alone at 93 with no children and no family to inherit her estate. Margaret Chen, whose name he had seen on legal documents and property records, but about whom he had never thought to ask any questions. She had been young once. She had been in love. And she had hidden that love away in an underground shelter, buried beneath decades of silence and secrecy, until an earthquake and a German shepherd had brought it back into the light. Daniel read all 24 letters that morning, unable to stop himself, despite the work that needed to be done, the damage that needed to be assessed, the life that demanded his attention. The story they told was heartbreaking and beautiful and infuriating all at once, a tale of forbidden love in an era that had no tolerance for people who dared to love differently. Margaret Chen had been a nurse at the Santa Barbara Cottage Hospital in the early 1960s, dedicated to her work and respected by her colleagues, a woman of Chinese-American heritage in a community that was still learning to accept diversity. James had been a patient, a young Marine who had been injured in a training accident and who had fallen in love with the nurse who cared for him during his long recovery. The problem, of course, was that James was white. And in 1962, in California, in America, that simple fact was enough to make their love not just controversial, but illegal. The state's anti-miscegenation laws wouldn't be struck down until 1967, and even then, the social stigma of interracial relationships would persist for decades more. Margaret and James had tried to be discreet, had tried to hide their feelings, but love has a way of showing itself regardless of circumstance. When they were discovered, when rumors began to spread through the hospital and the community, James had been transferred to a base in Vietnam. Not because the military cared about his relationship with Margaret, but because it was convenient, because it solved a problem without anyone having to acknowledge what the problem really was. The letters Daniel read had been written during James's deployment, sent from a war zone to a woman who waited and worried and loved from thousands of miles away. They were filled with tenderness and longing, with descriptions of jungle and rain, and the terrible boredom punctuated by moments of terror that Daniel recognized all too well from his own experiences. They spoke of plans for the future, of dreams that the two of them would be reunited, of a day when they could live openly as husband and wife without fear of persecution. They spoke of a child, a baby that Margaret had discovered she was carrying just weeks after James shipped out, a secret that she had kept from everyone except the man she loved. The last letter in the box was dated November 3, 1967, and it was different from all the others. It was written in a different hand, a masculine scrawl that Daniel assumed belonged to James himself. But it wasn't a love letter. It was a goodbye. My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then I did not make it home. I am so sorry, my love. I tried. God knows I tried. I promised you I would come back, that we would raise our daughter together, that we would show the world that love is stronger than hate. But some promises are not ours to keep. I built this shelter for you during my last leave, when we had those precious weeks together before I shipped out again. I wanted you to have a safe place, somewhere you could hide if the world ever became too dangerous for a woman like you loving a man like me. I wanted our daughter to know that her father thought of her, even before she was born, that he did everything he could to protect her and her mother. I am leaving this letter here, in the box where you keep the others, because I want you to know that I knew the risks. I knew that every patrol could be my last, every mission could end in ways I couldn't control. But I also want you to know that I have no regrets. Loving you was the best thing I ever did. Knowing that you carry our child gives me a peace that nothing else in this war has provided. Please don't mourn me forever, Margaret. Please don't let my death become a chain that binds you to sorrow. Live your life, raise our daughter, love again if you can. And know that wherever I am, whatever comes after this, I will be watching over you both, loving you both, grateful for every moment we had together. Tell her about me. Tell her that her father was a Marine, that he served his country with honor, that he died doing what he believed was right. But more than that, tell her that he loved her mother with all his heart, that their love was real and true and worth every sacrifice. Tell her that she was conceived in love, wanted beyond measure, dreamed of in the darkest nights of a war that never should have been. I love you, Margaret Chen. I loved you from the moment I saw you. I will love you until the end of time. Forever yours, James. Daniel sat at his kitchen table for a long time after he finished reading. The letters spread before him, the photograph of young Margaret propped against his coffee cup. Atlas had moved from under the table to sit beside him, the dog's head resting on Daniel's thigh, offering comfort in the way that only a dog can. The tears came slowly at first, then faster, streaming down Daniel's weathered face as he thought about the two young people who had loved each other across boundaries that should never have existed, who had dreamed of a future that war and prejudice had stolen from them. He thought about Margaret, who had lived in this house for more than 60 years after James's death. Had she ever married? The property records suggested she hadn't. She had died as Margaret Chen, the same name she had been born with. Had she raised her daughter alone, as James had asked? What had happened to that child, conceived in love and born into a world that might not have welcomed her? The letters raised more questions than they answered, and Daniel found himself desperate to know the rest of the story, to understand what had become of the people whose love had touched him so deeply. He started with the internet, searching for any information he could find about James, a Marine who had died in Vietnam in late 1967. It was a common enough story, tragically common, one of more than 58,000 American lives lost in that conflict. But finding specific information about a single soldier with only a first name proved nearly impossible. Daniel tried various combinations of search terms, scoured genealogy websites and military databases, but without a last name, he was searching for a needle in a haystack the size of a war. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Daniel had posted about his discovery on a local history Facebook group, hoping that someone in the Santa Barbara community might have information about Margaret Chen or her mysterious Marine lover. The post had gotten some attention, shared a few hundred times by people intrigued by the romantic mystery, but it was a private message 3 days later that changed everything. The message was from a woman named Sarah Morrison, and it was brief and to the point. "I think the man you're looking for was my grandfather. His name was James Robert Morrison, and he died in Vietnam on November 1, 1967. My grandmother told me about Margaret before she passed away. We need to talk." Daniel's hands were shaking as he typed his reply, giving Sarah his phone number and asking her to call as soon as possible. The phone rang less than an hour later, and the voice on the other end was warm but cautious, the voice of a woman who had her own questions about the past and wasn't sure whether to trust this stranger who had stumbled upon her family's secrets. The story Sarah told him filled in gaps that Daniel had been unable to bridge on his own. James Robert Morrison had been from a small town in Oklahoma, the son of farmers who had raised him to believe in God, country, and the American way. He had joined the Marines straight out of high school, eager to serve and see the world, never imagining that his service would take him to a hospital bed in Santa Barbara where he would meet the love of his life. His family had not approved of his relationship with Margaret, not because she was Chinese American, Sarah insisted, but because she was not Christian, not from their community, not the kind of woman they had imagined for their only son. When James was killed in action, his parents had mourned him as a hero, but had made no effort to contact the woman he had loved or the child she had borne. Sarah's grandmother had been James's younger sister, the only member of the family who had kept in touch with Margaret over the years. She had met the baby, a girl named Grace, and had stayed in sporadic contact until Margaret had asked her to stop, had said that it was too painful to maintain ties to a family that had rejected her. The sister had respected that wish, though it had broken her heart, and she had told Sarah about Margaret and Grace only in her final years, when the weight of secrets had become too heavy to carry alone. "I've always wondered what happened to them," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "My grandmother died before she could tell me everything, and I didn't know how to find them. Margaret Chen is such a common name, and I didn't even know where they had lived. To think that you found those letters, that you found the shelter James built, it feels like fate, somehow, like he wanted to be found." Daniel told her about the earthquake, about Atlas's insistent digging, about the hatch that had been buried for decades under accumulated soil and secrets. He read her portions of the letters, his voice breaking at times, and heard her crying on the other end of the line. They talked for more than 2 hours, two strangers connected by a love story that had begun before either of them was born, and by the end of the conversation, they had agreed to meet in person. Sarah wanted to see the shelter, to hold the letters that her great-uncle had written, to feel some connection to the man whose blood ran in her veins, but whose face she had never seen. But there was still the question of Grace, Margaret's daughter, James's daughter, the child whose existence had been the ultimate expression of their forbidden love. Sarah didn't know what had happened to her, whether she was alive or dead, whether she had ever known the truth about her father. Daniel promised to try to find out, to use whatever resources he could muster to locate the woman who should have been the rightful heir to Margaret's property and the keeper of her mother's secrets. The search for Grace Chen took Daniel into territories he had never expected to explore. He hired a private investigator, a woman named Rodriguez, who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. And he spent hours at the county recorder's office, searching through birth certificates and property records and the countless documents that track a person's passage through life. Atlas accompanied him everywhere, as he always did, and Daniel found himself talking to the dog about the case as if Atlas could understand and respond, bouncing theories off those intelligent brown eyes and taking comfort in the steady presence at his side. The investigation took weeks, but gradually a picture began to emerge. Grace Chen had been born on December 28, 1962, at Santa Barbara Cottage Hospital, the same hospital where her parents had met, though by then Margaret had left her nursing position to avoid the scandal that her pregnancy would have caused. Grace had grown up in the house that Daniel now owned, raised by a single mother who had never married, attending local schools and graduating near the top of her class. She had gone to UC Berkeley for college, studying sociology and becoming involved in the civil rights and anti-war movements that defined that turbulent era. And then, in 1984, she had apparently vanished. Rodriguez found a marriage certificate from 1983 showing that Grace Chen had married a man named Robert Washington in a ceremony in Oakland. But there the trail went cold. No divorce records, no death certificate, no change of address forms or voter registrations, or any of the other paper traces that people leave behind as they move through the world. Grace Chen Washington had simply ceased to exist as far as official records were concerned, disappearing into the vast anonymity of American life. The breakthrough came from a source that Daniel should have thought to consult earlier: the neighbors. The property adjacent to his, a sprawling ranch owned by a family named Okonkwo, had been in the same hands since the 1970s. The patriarch, Emmanuel Okonkwo, was in his 80s now and rarely left his home, but his daughter Victoria lived on the property and managed its affairs. When Daniel knocked on her door and explained what he was looking for, her face lit up with recognition.
Grace? Of course I remember Grace. She and my father were good friends, years ago. They used to talk for hours about civil rights and politics and the way the world was changing. My father was from Nigeria, you know. He came here in the 60s to study engineering, and he faced many of the same prejudices that Grace and her mother did. They understood each other in a way that few others could.
Victoria invited Daniel inside and served him tea while she called her father, whose memory proved remarkably sharp despite his advanced years. Emmanuel Okonkwo remembered Grace Chen vividly, a passionate, intelligent young woman who had never known her father but who had inherited his commitment to justice and his willingness to fight for what was right. He remembered Margaret, too, a quiet woman who had kept to herself but who had always been kind to her neighbors, who had raised her daughter with fierce devotion and never spoken about the man who had fathered her. "Grace used to ask me about the war," Emmanuel said, his voice crackling through the speakerphone. "She wanted to understand why her father had died, what he had been fighting for, whether it had meant anything at all. I couldn't give her the answers she wanted. No one could. But I think she found some peace in the anti-war movement, in working to make sure that other young men didn't die the way her father had." When Daniel asked about Grace's disappearance in 1984, Emmanuel fell silent for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with sadness. "She came to see me before she left. Her husband had been killed, shot by police during a traffic stop in Oakland. They said he had reached for something and they thought it was a weapon. It wasn't. It was his wallet. Grace was destroyed by it. She said she couldn't stay in America anymore, couldn't live in a country that kept killing the people she loved. She was going to Central America, she said, to help the refugees fleeing the civil wars there. She asked me not to tell anyone where she had gone. She wanted to disappear, to start over, to escape a life that had brought her nothing but loss." Daniel felt his heart sink. If Grace had gone to Central America in 1984, during the height of the conflicts that had ravaged the region, anything could have happened to her. She could have been killed. She could have died of disease or accident in areas with little access to medical care. Or she could still be alive, living under a different name in a different country, having built a new life far from the ghosts that had haunted her in California. But Emmanuel wasn't finished. She wrote to me once, maybe 10 years later. The letter came from a village in Guatemala, though she didn't give me an address. She said she had found some peace there, had married a local man, and was helping to run a school for children. She said she thought about her mother often, wondered how she was doing, but couldn't bring herself to come back. The pain was still too fresh, she said. Maybe someday, but not yet. "Do you still have the letter?" Daniel asked, hope flaring in his chest. "I kept everything," Emmanuel said. "Victoria can show you." The letter was yellowed and fragile, its edges worn from handling, but the handwriting was clear, and the words were alive with a voice that Daniel felt he was beginning to know. Grace had written about her work at the school, about the children who came to learn despite the poverty and violence that surrounded them, about a husband named Miguel who had taught her that love was still possible even after everything she had lost. She had written about her mother, wondering if Margaret was healthy, if she was lonely, if she had found any happiness in her later years. And she had written about her father, the man she had never met but whose presence she felt in her life every day. "I found his letters," Grace had written. Mama showed them to me when I was 18, when I was old enough to understand. I know now why she never talked about him, why she kept his memory locked away like something precious and fragile. She loved him too much to speak of him without breaking. But I'm glad I know. I'm glad I can carry his memory with me, even here, even so far from home. He was a good man who loved my mother despite everything that told him he shouldn't.
That's a legacy worth honoring. Daniel read the letter 3 times, committing its words to memory, feeling a connection to this woman he had never met growing stronger with each reading. Grace Chen Washington was out there somewhere, possibly still in Guatemala, possibly still running the school she had written about 25 years ago. Finding her would not be easy. It might not even be possible. But Daniel knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that he had to try. The journey to Guatemala was something Daniel had not planned for and had not expected to undertake. He had never been to Central America, had never had reason to go, and the idea of leaving his damaged property and his familiar routines to search for a woman who might not want to be found was terrifying in ways that combat had never been. But Atlas seemed to sense that this mission was important, and when Daniel began making preparations, applying for a passport, researching the region, learning basic Spanish, the German shepherd stayed closer to him than ever, as if offering his support for whatever lay ahead. Sarah Morrison insisted on coming along. "He was my family too," she said, when Daniel tried to talk her out of it. "James was my great-uncle. Grace is my cousin, even if we've never met. I have just as much right to find her as you do." Daniel couldn't argue with that logic, and if he was being honest with himself, he was grateful for the company. Whatever they found in Guatemala, it would be easier to face with someone who understood why it mattered. They flew into Guatemala City on a Thursday morning in January, 3 months after the earthquake that had started everything. The city was chaotic and overwhelming, a sensory assault that Daniel's combat instincts struggled to process as anything other than potential threats. But they weren't staying in the city. Their destination was a small village in the highlands called San Pedro Necta, which Emmanuel Okonkwo had identified from the postmark on Grace's letter. It would take a day to get there, traveling by bus through mountains that put California's landscape to shame. And Daniel found himself grateful for Atlas's calming presence as they navigated a world that felt alien in every way. San Pedro Necta was a cluster of buildings clinging to the side of a mountain, its cobblestone streets and colonial architecture speaking to a history that stretched back centuries before the United States existed. The air was thin and cool at this altitude, and the people they passed looked at them with a mixture of curiosity and wariness that Daniel recognized from his deployments, the look of a community that had learned to be cautious of strangers. But Atlas seemed to put people at ease. Children ran up to pet him. Old women smiled at his gentle demeanor, and doors that might have remained closed began to open. They found the school on their second day in the village. It was a modest building on the edge of town, its walls painted in bright colors that stood out against the muted tones of the surrounding landscape. A hand-painted sign above the door read, Escuela de Esperanza, School of Hope, and Daniel felt something catch in his throat at the name, hope. The same word he had thought of when he first read Margaret's letters, the same quality that had characterized her love for James despite everything that had stood against them. The woman who emerged from the school when they knocked was not Grace. She was younger, perhaps in her 40s, with indigenous features and a warm smile that immediately put Daniel at ease. Her name was Isabella, she said, and she had been running the school for the past 5 years, ever since the previous director had retired. When Daniel asked about Grace Chen Washington, Isabella's face softened with recognition and something that looked like love. "Graciela," she said, using the Spanish version of the name. "You're looking for Graciela. She was the one who started this school, you know. She and her husband Miguel. They came here in the 80s, when everything was chaos, when people were dying and fleeing, and the world seemed like it was ending. They stayed when others left. They built something beautiful out of all that destruction." "Is she still alive?" Daniel asked, his heart pounding. Isabella nodded. "She lives about an hour from here, in a smaller village up the mountain. Miguel passed away 10 years ago, and she couldn't bear to stay here without him.
But she visits sometimes. She still cares about the school, about the children. She's 80 years old now, but her mind is sharp and her heart is strong." The drive up the mountain took longer than an hour, the road narrowing to little more than a dirt track as they climbed higher into the clouds. Daniel had rented a vehicle in Guatemala City, a sturdy SUV that handled the terrain better than he had expected, and Sarah sat in the passenger seat with Atlas's head in her lap, all of them silent with the weight of what they were about to do. They were going to meet Grace. They were going to tell her about her mother's death, about the letters in the shelter, about James's family who had finally come to find her. They were going to change her world, and Daniel wasn't sure they had the right. The village was tiny, perhaps a dozen houses clustered around a small church, and finding Grace's home was simply a matter of asking the first person they saw and following their pointed finger. Her house was the last one on the left, a small structure with a garden that overflowed with flowers, and a view of the valley below that took Daniel's breath away. There was a woman sitting on the porch, her white hair pulled back in a braid, her weathered face turned toward the mountains, as if she was waiting for something. When she heard them approach, she turned, and Daniel saw her eyes, Margaret's eyes, dark and intelligent and somehow ancient despite the decades that had passed since that photograph was taken. "You're Americans," Grace said. It wasn't a question. "I wondered when someone would come." Daniel didn't know what to say. All the words he had prepared, all the explanations and reassurances and careful approaches fled from his mind as he stood before this woman who had spent 40 years running from a past that had finally caught up with her. It was Atlas who broke the silence, pulling gently at his leash and walking toward Grace with the calm certainty that characterized everything he did. He sat at her feet and looked up at her, and something in Grace's face shifted, softened, opened. "What a beautiful dog," she said, reaching down to touch Atlas's head. "What's his name?" "Atlas," Daniel said. "He's the one who found you. Well, he found the letters. The rest of it, that was just following where they led." Grace's hand stilled on Atlas's fur. "The letters," she repeated. "My father's letters. I haven't thought about those in years. I left them in the shelter, you know. I couldn't bring them with me. They were too heavy to carry, even though they weighed almost nothing." "There was an earthquake," Sarah said, stepping forward. "In October. It exposed the shelter, and Daniel's dog started digging. And, well, we found them. All of them, including the one your father wrote before he died." Grace closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, they were bright with tears. "My mother showed me that letter when I was 18. She had saved it all those years, keeping it safe, reading it when she needed to remember that she had been loved. It was the most precious thing she owned, and she shared it with me because she wanted me to know who my father was, what he had done, how much he had loved us both." "We brought them with us," Daniel said. "The letters, the photograph, everything we found. We thought, we hoped, you might want them back." He reached into his bag and withdrew the cedar box, unchanged, except for a careful cleaning that had restored some of its original beauty. He held it out to Grace, and she took it with hands that trembled, cradling it against her chest like something infinitely precious. For a long moment, no one spoke. The mountain wind whispered through the flowers in Grace's garden, and somewhere in the valley below, a bird was singing. "My mother died 3 years ago," Grace said finally. "I didn't know until months later. A lawyer contacted me. She had left instructions, you see, in case anyone ever found me. She wanted me to know that she had never stopped loving me, that she had never blamed me for leaving, that she understood why I had to go. She left me the house, the property, everything she had. But I couldn't go back. I couldn't face it. So I let it go to the state, let them sell it to whoever wanted it, let someone else deal with the memories that were too heavy for me to carry." "That was me," Daniel said. "I bought the property. I live there now, with Atlas. And if I had known any of this, I would have found you sooner. I would have made sure you knew." Grace looked at him with those dark, ancient eyes, and for a moment, Daniel felt as if she was seeing through him, seeing every wound and every scar and every nightmare that had followed him home from war. "You're a veteran," she said. It wasn't a question either. Yes. My father was too, and my husband's brother, and so many others who went to wars they didn't start and came back broken, or didn't come back at all. She paused, her gaze drifting to Atlas, who had settled at her feet with his head on his paws. I spent a lot of years being angry about that. Angry at the governments that sent them, angry at the world that created the conditions for so much violence, angry at God for letting it happen. But anger is exhausting. Eventually, you have to let it go, or it consumes you entirely. "I know," Daniel said, and he did. He knew it in his bones, in the years of therapy and medication and slow, painful healing that had brought him to a place where he could function again. "That's part of why I'm here. I read your father's letters, and I felt connected somehow. To him, to your mother, to you. I needed to find you. I needed to know how the story ended." Grace smiled, a sad and beautiful expression that transformed her weathered face. "Stories don't end," she said. "They just continue, in different forms, with different people. My father's story didn't end when he died. It continued in my mother, in me, in the children I've taught, and the lives I've touched. And now it continues in you, a stranger who found his letters and cared enough to bring them back to me." She opened the cedar box and looked at the photograph of her mother, young and beautiful and full of hope. "I think he would have liked that. I think they both would have." Daniel and Sarah stayed in Guatemala for 2 weeks. They spent hours with Grace each day, listening to her stories, sharing their own, building a connection that felt both impossibly new and anciently familiar. Grace told them about her childhood in the house that Daniel now owned, about her mother's quiet strength and fierce love, about the absent father whose presence she had felt in every letter and every memory her mother shared. She told them about Robert, her first husband, whose death had shattered her faith in America's promises of justice and equality. She told them about Miguel, her second husband, who had shown her that love was possible even after the worst losses, that hope could survive even the darkest circumstances. Sarah told Grace about her grandmother, James's sister, who had carried the secret of Margaret and the baby for decades. She showed Grace photographs of James as a child, as a teenager, as a young Marine about to ship out to a war that would claim his life. Grace wept over those photographs, tracing her father's features with her fingers, seeing her own face in his for the first time. "I have his eyes," she said, and Sarah nodded, because it was true. The same dark, intelligent eyes that had looked out from Margaret's photograph were looking at them now, 70 years later, in a village in the Guatemalan highlands. And Daniel told Grace about himself, about his deployments, his injuries, his struggles with PTSD and depression, and the feeling of purposelessness that had plagued him since his discharge. About Atlas, who had been trained as a search and rescue dog, but who had become so much more, a companion, a therapist, a reason to get up in the morning when nothing else seemed worth the effort. About the earthquake that had disrupted his fragile peace, and somehow, through the chaos, led him to something meaningful. "You were meant to find those letters," Grace said one evening, as they sat on her porch watching the sunset behind the mountains. "I don't believe in coincidence. I believe that everything happens for a reason, even if we can't see it at the time. You needed a purpose. My parents' story needed to be told. And Atlas," she reached down to stroke the dog's head, "Atlas knew. Dogs always know. They sense things that we humans are too blind or too afraid to see." Daniel thought about that as he watched the last light fade from the sky. He had never been particularly spiritual, had struggled to maintain the faith of his childhood through everything he had seen and done in war. But sitting here, in this improbable place, with this remarkable woman who had emerged from a love story buried for decades, he felt something he couldn't quite name. Not faith exactly, but something close to it. A sense that the universe was larger and stranger and more interconnected than he had ever imagined. A feeling that his life, with all its pain and loss and seemingly random wanderings, might actually be going somewhere meaningful. On their last day in Guatemala, Grace asked Daniel to take her to a particular spot, a small cemetery on the outskirts of San Pedro Necta, where Miguel was buried. It was a peaceful place, shaded by ancient trees and overlooking the valley, and Miguel's grave was marked by a simple stone with his name, his dates, and a single word, beloved. Grace stood before it for a long time, her lips moving in what might have been prayer, while Daniel and Sarah waited at a respectful distance. When she returned to them, her eyes were dry, but her expression was peaceful. "I want to go back," she said, "to California, to my mother's house. I thought I couldn't face it, but I was wrong. I've been running for 40 years, and I'm tired of running. I want to see where my parents' story began. I want to stand in the shelter where my father hid his letters. I want to visit my mother's grave and tell her that I finally came home." Daniel's heart leaped. "You're welcome to stay as long as you want. The house is yours, really. I'm just taking care of it for you." Grace shook her head. "The house is yours now. You bought it, you've lived in it, you found the secrets it was hiding. I don't want it back. But I would like to visit. I would like to see what you've done with it. I would like to meet this property that I ran away from so long ago and make peace with it at last." They flew back to California together, Grace marveling at how much had changed since she left, Sarah documenting everything with the enthusiasm of a woman who had found family she never knew she had. The journey from the airport to Daniel's property took them through landscapes that Grace recognized and landscapes that she didn't, a mix of familiar and foreign that mirrored the experience of returning to a home that had become something else in your absence. When they pulled up to the house, Grace sat in silence for a long moment, taking it in. The repairs from the earthquake were still ongoing, with scaffolding around one corner and a pile of lumber waiting to be used, but the house itself stood solid and welcoming, exactly as it had stood when Margaret lived there, when Grace grew up there, when James built the shelter in the hillside to protect the woman and child he loved. "It's smaller than I remember," Grace said finally, "but also exactly the same. Isn't that strange? Memory plays such tricks on us." Atlas jumped out of the car and ran to the front door, tail wagging, clearly happy to be home. Grace followed more slowly, her hand trailing along the fence, the garden wall, the frame of the door that her mother must have touched 10,000 times. Inside, she walked through each room with the careful attention of an archaeologist exploring a tomb, pausing to examine photographs that Daniel had hung, furniture that he had bought, the small changes that had transformed her childhood home into someone else's sanctuary. "You've made it beautiful," she said. "My mother would have liked what you've done with it. She always wanted more color, more light, more life in these rooms, but she was too tired to do it herself by the end. Too tired and too sad and too stuck in memories that wouldn't let her go." Daniel didn't know what to say to that, so he said nothing. He simply led Grace outside, to the hillside where the earthquake had exposed the shelter, where Atlas had dug with such determination, where everything had begun. The hatch was still there, cleared of debris now, its steel surface gleaming in the afternoon sun. Daniel had had an engineer inspect it, had been assured that the structure was sound, that it had been built to last by someone who knew what they were doing. James Morrison, Marine, engineer of his own secret refuge, had built well. His shelter had survived 60 years underground and would probably survive 60 more. Grace descended the ladder without hesitation, her 80-year-old body moving with a certainty that belied her age. Daniel followed, and Sarah after him, and finally Atlas, who had learned to navigate the rungs during Daniel's many explorations of the space. They stood together in the underground room, 4 people and a dog, surrounded by the dust and silence of decades. "He built this for us," Grace whispered, "for my mother and me. He built this before I was even born, when I was just a possibility, a hope for the future. He wanted us to be safe." She walked to the desk, now empty except for a single photograph that Daniel had placed there, the same photograph that had been in the cedar box, young Margaret in her nurse's uniform. She never knew he built it. He never had a chance to tell her before he shipped out. She found it years later when she was exploring the property, and she knew immediately what it was. She told me she sat down here and cried for hours, overwhelmed by the love of a man who had been dead for decades. That's why she kept the letters here, Sarah said, because this was his place. This was where he had put his love for her. Grace nodded. She couldn't bear to have them in the house where she would see them every day. But she couldn't destroy them either, so she kept them here, in the place he had made, and she would come down sometimes to read them, to remember, to feel close to him again. It was her secret, her private communion with a ghost. She never told me about the shelter until I was about to leave for college. She said she wanted me to have a place where I could feel my father's presence, even though I had never met him. Daniel thought about that as he looked around the underground room. He had spent hours down here since the earthquake, reading and rereading the letters, trying to understand the people who had created this hidden monument to their love. He had felt their presence, or thought he had, a warmth that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, a sense of being watched over by benevolent spirits. Maybe it had been his imagination. Maybe it had been the desperate hope of a damaged man searching for meaning in a meaningless world. But standing here now, with Grace and Sarah and Atlas, he didn't think so. Something was here, something real and powerful and eternal, something that had survived war and prejudice and death and time, and would survive long after all of them were gone. They climbed back out of the shelter as the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost impossibly beautiful. Grace asked to visit her mother's grave, and Daniel drove her to the small cemetery in Goleta, where Margaret Chen had been laid to rest 3 years earlier. The gravestone was simple, just her name and dates, and a single phrase that Grace said she had chosen herself: she loved and was loved. Grace knelt before the stone and placed her hand on the cold marble, her lips moving in words that Daniel couldn't hear. He stepped back to give her privacy, watching from a distance as an 80-year-old woman said goodbye to her mother for perhaps the last time. Atlas sat beside him, quiet and watchful, his presence a comfort in the face of grief that Daniel understood all too well. When Grace finally rose, her face was wet with tears, but her expression was peaceful. "Thank you," she said to Daniel. "Thank you for finding the letters. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for bringing me home." "I should be thanking you," Daniel said. "Finding those letters, it changed something in me. I can't explain it exactly, but I feel different now, more connected, more alive, like I have a purpose again, even if I don't quite understand what it is." Grace smiled and reached out to touch his face, a gesture so maternal and unexpected that Daniel felt tears spring to his own eyes. "You found a love story buried under 60 years of earth and silence," she said. "You followed it across countries and continents, through bureaucracies and dead ends, because you believed it mattered. That tells me everything I need to know about who you are. My father would have liked you, my mother would have liked you. And she paused, her eyes moving to Atlas, who was watching her with his characteristic intensity. "I think I like you too." Grace stayed in California for a month. She slept in the house where she had grown up, walked the property where her father had built his shelter, visited the places that had defined her childhood before the world tore everything apart. She met with lawyers and accountants, sorting out the complications of an estate she had abandoned decades ago, making arrangements for the future that she had spent so long avoiding. And she spent hours with Daniel and Sarah and Atlas, building a family of choice from the fragments of families lost. The story of the letters spread, as stories do in the age of social media. A journalist from the Los Angeles Times heard about it and drove up to interview Daniel and Grace, producing a feature article that ran on the front page of the Sunday edition. The article was picked up by national outlets, shared millions of times, turned into one of those viral phenomena that capture the public imagination for reasons that no one can quite explain. People wrote to Daniel from around the world, telling him their own stories of love and loss, and letters found, and secrets revealed. He tried to answer every message, tried to give each person the attention they deserved, but the volume was overwhelming. In the end, he had to hire a part-time assistant just to manage the correspondence. The attention led to opportunities that Daniel had never imagined. A literary agent approached him about writing a book. A documentary filmmaker wanted to tell the story on screen. Universities invited him to speak about history and love and the strange ways that the past intrudes upon the present. Daniel declined most of these offers, preferring his quiet life with Atlas to the spotlight that celebrity would bring. But he accepted a few, particularly those that gave him a platform to talk about veterans' issues and the healing power of animals. If his unlikely discovery could help others the way it had helped him, then the disruption was worth it. Sarah Morrison became a regular visitor to the property, driving up from San Diego, where she lived with her husband and children. She and Grace formed a bond that transcended the complicated history that connected them. Two women who might have been strangers forever if not for an earthquake and a dog and a box of letters buried in a hillside. They compared family photographs, traced genealogies, filled in the gaps in each other's knowledge about the people they had loved and lost. James Morrison, dead at 24 in a jungle on the other side of the world, would have been proud of the family that had grown from his sacrifice. And Grace eventually returned to Guatemala, to the village where she had built a new life, to the school that carried on her legacy of hope. But she came back to California every year after that, spending weeks at a time in the house that Daniel now shared with her in spirit, if not in law. She watched the seasons change on the property, watched Daniel's garden grow and flourish, watched Atlas age with the grace and dignity that characterized everything the dog did. She told Daniel stories about her parents, her childhood, her years of wandering, filling in the narrative that the letters had only sketched. And Daniel listened, absorbing every word, adding Grace's memories to the archive of love and loss that had begun with a desperate cry in a snowstorm and led, through impossible circumstances, to this improbable communion of souls. Atlas died on a spring morning 5 years after the earthquake, peacefully and without warning, his great heart simply stopping as he lay in his favorite spot by the fire. Daniel had known it was coming. The dog was 13 years old, ancient by German Shepherd standards, but the loss still devastated him. He buried Atlas on the hillside, near the entrance to the shelter, marking the grave with a stone that read, "Atlas. He found what was lost. He brought us together. He was loved." Grace flew in for the burial, and Sarah drove up, and the three of them stood together as Daniel lowered his companion into the earth. They spoke about Atlas's life, his accomplishments, the people he had saved during his years as a search and rescue dog, and the hearts he had healed simply by being present. They spoke about the earthquake, the discovery, the journey that had led them all to this moment. And they spoke about the future, about the stories that would continue to unfold, about the lives that would be touched by the love that had survived against all odds. He knew, Grace said as they walked back to the house, he knew there was something in that hillside. He knew it needed to be found. Dogs understand things that we don't, see connections that we're blind to. I think Atlas was a kind of angel, sent to do a job that no human could do. Daniel didn't know if he believed in angels, but he believed in Atlas. He believed in the extraordinary perception that had led the dog to dig in exactly the right spot, at exactly the right time, to unearth secrets that had waited 60 years to be revealed. He believed in the bond they had shared, the wordless communication that had allowed them to work together in perfect harmony. And he believed that whatever force governed the universe, whatever power moved through all living things, it had worked through Atlas to accomplish something meaningful. 6 months after Atlas's death, Daniel adopted another German Shepherd, a young female from a rescue organization that specialized in placing service dogs with veterans. He named her Hope in honor of Margaret's love and Grace's school, and the quality that had sustained everyone touched by this story. Hope was different from Atlas in temperament and personality, but she had the same intelligence in her eyes, the same devotion in her heart. And when Daniel took her to the shelter for the first time, she sniffed around the underground room with an intensity that suggested she understood, somehow, the significance of the place. The letters remained in the cedar box, preserved now under glass, in a place of honor in Daniel's living room. Visitors who came to see the famous shelter would often pause before the display, reading the words that James had written to Margaret more than 60 years ago, marveling at the love that had survived war and prejudice and death. Some wept, some smiled, all left changed in some small way, touched by a story that reminded them that love was real and powerful and worth fighting for. Daniel continued to live in the house, continued to tend the garden and walk the trails, and maintain the shelter that James Morrison had built with his own hands. He grew old there, surrounded by the ghosts of the past and the hopes of the future, finding purpose in the preservation of a legacy that had been entrusted to him by fate. Grace visited every year until she couldn't travel anymore, and then she sent letters instead, handwritten letters in the old style that Daniel would read aloud to Hope and imagine were messages from another time. When Grace died at 92, she was buried in Guatemala beside Miguel, in the cemetery overlooking the valley that had been her home for 40 years. But a memorial was placed in the shelter in California, a plaque that read, "Grace Chen Morrison Washington, daughter of James and Margaret, keeper of the flame. May she rest in eternal hope." Daniel hung it on the wall beside the desk where Margaret had kept her letters, completing a circle that had begun before he was born and would continue long after he was gone. The story of the buried hatch and the letters that brought tears had become, by then, something larger than any of the individuals involved. It had been written about in books and featured in documentaries. It had been taught in schools as an example of love transcending boundaries. It had inspired countless people to search their own histories for buried secrets, to reach out across divides of time and distance and difference, to believe that connection was possible even when it seemed impossible. James Morrison and Margaret Chen had never dreamed, when they fell in love in a Santa Barbara hospital in 1962, that their story would touch millions of lives. But that was the nature of love, Daniel had come to understand. It multiplied, it expanded. It found ways to grow even in the most inhospitable circumstances, and it left seeds that would blossom for generations to come. On the last day of his own life, Daniel sat on the porch of the house that had become his home, Hope lying at his feet, watching the sunset over the hills of California. He was 91 years old, had outlived almost everyone he had ever known, had seen the world change in ways that would have been unimaginable when he was young. But the hills were the same. The sunset was the same. The love that permeated this place, soaked into its very soil, was the same as it had been when James built his shelter, and Margaret kept her letters, and Grace ran away and came back again. Daniel closed his eyes and thought about all of them. James, Margaret, Grace, Miguel, Sarah, Atlas. He thought about the earthquake that had disrupted everything and somehow led to something beautiful. He thought about the letters, still preserved in their cedar box, still speaking across the decades with a voice that would never be silenced. He thought about Hope, the dog at his feet, named for the quality that had defined this entire improbable journey. And then he thought about nothing at all, because the time for thinking had passed. The sun dipped below the horizon, the stars came out one by one, and Daniel Reeves, veteran and seeker and keeper of secrets, breathed his last breath in the place where love had been buried and found again. The shelter remains, to this day, on the property in the hills above Goleta. The house changed hands several times after Daniel's death, but each new owner understood the significance of what lay beneath the hillside, understood the responsibility they had inherited along with the deed. The cedar box, with its precious letters, is now housed in a museum in Santa Barbara, where visitors can read James's words to Margaret and trace the story that began with a forbidden love and ended with a legacy that spans continents and generations. And sometimes, when the wind is right and the light is golden, people say they can hear something in those hills. Not ghosts exactly, but memories, echoes of love that was too strong to die, too precious to stay buried forever. Echoes that waited 60 years for an earthquake and a dog and a broken veteran who needed something to believe in. They found each other, all of them, across the barriers of time and death and circumstance. And in finding each other, they found something eternal. That is the truth that brings tears. That is the story that will never end.